It started with something small, a delay, a silence that stretched longer than it should have. On the afternoon of April 5th, 1963, a babysitter waited for Sonia McCaskey to arrive and pick up her 10-month-old son. Sonia was a young single mother, organized, punctual, and deeply devoted to her children. She didn't forget responsibilities. She didn't arrive late without calling. Ever. Minutes passed, then an hour. The baby grew restless. Evening crept closer. Still no sign of Sonia. At first, the babysitter tried to stay calm. Maybe Sonia had been held up at work, maybe traffic, maybe a last-minute errand. But as time went on, concern turned into unease. This wasn't just late anymore. This was wrong. What made it worse was the pattern. Sonia hadn't called, she hadn't sent word, and she hadn't shown up at her job either. Another detail that would soon raise alarm bells. 2 absences, 1 woman, no explanation. By nightfall, the babysitter made the decision no one wants to make. She contacted the authorities, because in a city where people still left doors unlocked, one truth was already clear. If Sonia McCaskey hadn't come for her child, it wasn't by choice. Something had stopped her. And whatever that was, it wasn't normal. For Sonia McCaskey, being late meant something was terribly wrong. To her neighbors, Sonia McCaskey was easy to miss. She wasn't loud. She didn't host parties. She didn't draw attention to herself. She was the kind of woman people described as polite, quiet, focused, the kind you nod to in the hallway and assume will always be there tomorrow. Sonia's life hadn't started easy. Born in Scotland, she lost her father young and immigrated to the United States with her mother, learning early how to adapt, endure, and keep moving forward. Discipline became second nature. By her teens, she had found an escape in skiing, an obsession that turned into an Olympic dream. In 1960, she competed in the Winter Olympics. She didn't medal, she didn't win. In fact, she finished last. But she came home anyway, rebuilt her life anyway, and never let that disappointment define her. Most people don't recover from public failure like that. Sonia did, quietly. By her early 20s, she was living in Reno, divorced, raising 2 young children largely on her own, working full-time, teaching skiing part-time. No drama, no chaos, just routine, responsibility, and exhaustion. She kept journals, she paid her bills, she showed up. Those who knew her described Sonia as reserved but warm, independent but not reckless. She didn't invite trouble, she didn't chase danger. Her life may not have been glamorous anymore, but it was stable. And that's what made what happened next so unsettling. Because Sonia McCaskey wasn't a woman spiraling out of control. She wasn't lost, she wasn't reckless, she was surviving. She survived failure, divorce, and struggle, but not that night, April 4th, 1963. It was an ordinary Thursday, one of those days that leaves no mark in memory. Sonia McCaskey returned to her small apartment on Yory Avenue at around 4:30 p.m., just as she always did after work. No rush, no urgency, no sense of danger. She had no known plans for the evening, no appointments, no visitors expected. Her baby was with a babysitter, safe for the night. Her other child was staying with family. For once, the apartment was quiet. In Reno at the time, life moved slower. People trusted each other. Doors were often left unlocked, not out of carelessness, but confidence. Neighbors came and went without fear. Sonia lived in that world. She had no reason not to. There was no sign of distress, no frantic phone calls, no reports of arguments or strange visitors, no indication that anything or anyone was out of place. To anyone watching from the outside, it was just another evening settling in. Somewhere between routine and rest, Sonia went inside and closed the door behind her. That's the last confirmed moment anyone saw her alive. No witnesses would later recall screams. No neighbors would remember loud music or raised voices. Nothing that hinted at violence. Nothing that warned of what was about to happen within those walls. That's what makes this moment so unsettling. Because when the night began, Sonia McCaskey was safe, at home, in a city that believed it didn't need locks. Nothing suggested this would be her last night alive. When police entered Sonia McCaskey's apartment, nothing immediately screamed danger. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no overturned furniture. The space looked lived in, not ransacked. At first glance, it didn't resemble the aftermath of a violent crime at all. That illusion didn't last long. Officers moved toward the bedroom, and that's where everything changed. At the foot of the bed sat a cedar chest. Ordinary. The kind used to store blankets, keepsakes, personal items. One officer opened it. Inside was Sonia. The moment the lid was lifted, seasoned investigators understood this scene was unlike anything they had encountered before. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't panic. It wasn't the result of a sudden outburst. What lay before them showed intent, time, and an extreme level of violence that felt deliberate rather than reactive. Police would later describe it as the worst crime scene they had ever witnessed. They stopped treating the apartment as a missing person case and sealed it as a homicide scene immediately. Detectives, supervisors, forensic teams, everyone was called in. The tone shifted from concern to disbelief. Whatever had happened here hadn't been quick, and it hadn't been accidental. The chest wasn't a hiding place, it was a statement. This wasn't just murder, it was something far darker. As investigators worked through Sonia McCaskey's apartment, one detail unsettled them more than any other. There was no forced entry, no broken lock, no pried door, no shattered window. Whoever entered Sonia's home didn't break in. They walked in. In Reno, this detail spread faster than any official statement. In the early 1960s, the city still lived on trust. Many residents didn't lock their doors, especially in quiet neighborhoods like Sonia's. It wasn't seen as reckless. It was normal. But now, that normal felt dangerous. If the killer hadn't forced their way inside, it meant one of two things. Sonia knew them, or someone took advantage of a culture built on safety and assumption. Either way, the implications were terrifying. Neighbors began replaying their own routines in their heads. Had they left their doors unlocked the night before? Had someone walked past their home unnoticed? Within days, the atmosphere changed. Hardware stores sold out of locks. Extra bolts appeared on doors that had never needed them before. Families double-checked windows before bed. Conversations that once felt harmless now carried an edge of fear. Reno had lost more than a young woman. It had lost its sense of security. Because if a killer could enter Sonia McCaskey's home without resistance, then no home was truly closed to him. Whatever walked into Sonia's home could walk into anyone's. In the days that followed, investigators tried to make sense of what they had seen. They reached for familiar explanations. The precision of the wounds led to an early theory. This had to be someone with training, a butcher, a surgeon, someone comfortable with anatomy, someone practiced. It was an attempt to impose order on something that felt chaotic and overwhelming. But the theory didn't sit right. Reno wasn't a city full of surgeons working in secret, and nothing about Sonia's life pointed towards someone with that kind of background crossing her path. Police turned next to Sonia herself. Her diaries were read closely. Lines of poetry, some dark, some introspective, were pulled apart and examined for hidden meaning. To outsiders, the words looked troubling. To those who knew her, they were simply private reflections. a young woman processing grief, disappointment, and pressure through writing. There were no threats, no warnings, no signs she feared someone specific. Investigators questioned the men closest to her, her ex-husband, former partners, the father of her youngest child. Each was examined, interviewed, and tested against timelines and evidence. One by one, they were cleared. None had the opportunity. None had the forensic link. None fit the behavior at the scene. And slowly, an uncomfortable truth emerged. The killer wasn't someone obvious. He wasn't someone known. He wasn't someone who belonged in Sonia McCaskey's life or her neighborhood. The early profile had created a false sense of direction. While police looked for someone skilled, connected, or familiar, the real threat remained unseen, out of place, unattached, unaccounted for. The man responsible didn't fit the theory, the victim, or the city, which meant he could have come from anywhere. And worse, he could still be nearby. The killer didn't fit the theory, or the neighborhood. The investigation stalled until police noticed what wasn't there. In Sonia McCaskey's apartment, officers found a camera manual lying quietly among her belongings. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't damaged, it looked ordinary. But the camera itself was gone. That detail mattered. This wasn't a burglary. Nothing else of value had been taken. Jewelry remained. Personal items were untouched. Only one object was missing, and it was portable, specific, and easy to sell. Police shifted direction. They traced the manual to a rare German-made camera model, uncommon enough to narrow the search. Detectives contacted pawn shops across Reno, asking a simple question: had anyone sold a camera like this recently? One shop owner remembered immediately. A teenage boy had come in days earlier, nervous, quiet. He sold the camera for $10. He gave a real name, but a fake address. That was enough. Investigators tracked him down quickly. He was young, unsteady, out of place in a case this violent, and when officers brought him in for questioning, something changed. He tried to run, not far, just far enough to confirm what instinct already had. This wasn't a professional. This wasn't a surgeon. This wasn't someone Sonia knew. The case hadn't been cracked by profiling, psychology, or theory. It had been cracked by a missing object and a careless sale. A $10 transaction cracked the case. The name from the pawn shop receipt led police to an 18-year-old local teenager, Thomas Lee Bean. At first glance, he didn't fit any expectation investigators had formed. He wasn't older, he wasn't skilled, he wasn't connected to Sonia McCaskey in any visible way. He was young, restless, and barely holding himself together. But the details began to stack up. The address he gave the pawn shop was fake. Not a mistake, an intentional misdirection. When officers located him and asked him to come in for questioning, his composure cracked almost immediately. Before police could even begin asking questions, he ran, not out of panic, out of instinct. He made it 2 blocks before officers caught him. That brief attempt to disappear told investigators more than words ever could. Innocent people don't flee before accusations are made. Then came the forensic link. At Sonia's apartment, a bare footprint had been found in blood on the floor, an unusual and haunting detail. When Thomas was examined, the match was unmistakable. Size, shape, pressure points. It aligned. The killer hadn't worn shoes. That meant he had entered quietly, intentionally, with time. The image of a calculated professional adult dissolved completely. In its place stood something far more unsettling, a young man capable of extreme violence, acting alone, unseen, and uninvited. By the time Thomas sat across from detectives, the theory of who could have done this no longer mattered. The evidence had chosen him, and before police spoke a single word, he had already tried to vanish. Before police spoke, he tried to disappear. Detectives expected resistance, denial, confusion, fear. They got none of it. When Thomas Lee Bean sat down in the interrogation room, he didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask what evidence police had. He didn't try to explain the camera, the footprint, or the flight attempt. He confessed, immediately, calmly, as if he were describing something ordinary, something already settled in his own mind. There were no tears, no visible panic, no flicker of regret. His voice stayed level as he walked detectives through what he had done, not rushed, not defensive, just factual. Investigators would later say this was the most unsettling part. People who commit crimes often hesitate. They test the room. They look for sympathy or an opening. Thomas did neither. He spoke as though the outcome no longer mattered. There was no effort to minimize his actions, no attempt to shift blame, no emotional response to the reality of a life taken. It wasn't shock, it wasn't bravado, it was absence. The room grew quiet as detectives realized they weren't dealing with someone overwhelmed by guilt or fear. They were listening to someone completely detached from consequence. In that moment, the brutality of the crime no longer felt chaotic. It felt intentional, planned, internally rehearsed long before it ever happened. The violence wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by indifference. And that indifference made the confession far more disturbing than any denial could have been. He didn't hesitate. He didn't struggle. He didn't care. It wasn't personal. That was the most terrifying realization of all. Thomas Lee Bean didn't follow Sonia McCaskey. He didn't know her routines. He didn't study her life or build a connection. There was no argument, no history, no emotional trigger. There was only opportunity. That night, Sonia's door was unlocked, something entirely ordinary in Reno at the time. Her laundry hung outside. Her car was parked where it always was. The apartment looked lived in, calm, unguarded. To Thomas, it wasn't a home. It was an opening. He would later explain that he was driving through the neighborhood, drifting without direction, when he noticed the small details. The unlocked door, the quiet, the absence of resistance before it even began. That was enough. Sonia wasn't chosen because of who she was. She wasn't chosen because of something she did. She wasn't chosen at all. She was simply there, available. Investigators would later struggle with this part more than any other, because random violence leaves no warning signs, no pattern a victim can recognize, no decision that could have been made differently. There was nothing Sonia failed to do. She lived the way her city lived, open, trusting, unaware that someone was actively looking for a door that wasn't closed. That randomness shattered the last illusion of safety Reno had left, because if the crime wasn't about motive, and it wasn't about connection, then it could have happened to anyone. She wasn't targeted, she was available. That was all it took to reach a verdict of guilty. For some in the room, it felt like relief. For others, it felt unreal, how something so violent, so devastating, could be reduced to barely more than an hour of discussion. The prosecution had spent days explaining the crime. The jury needed just over an hour to decide his fate. When the sentence was read, the room expected emotion. They didn't get it. Bean smiled, not nervously, not in disbelief. A small, casual smile, as if the outcome confirmed something he had already accepted. There was no visible anger, no fear, no remorse. The judge sentenced him to death. It should have felt like closure, but for many watching, it didn't. Justice had moved quickly, efficiently, but it couldn't undo what had already happened. It couldn't give Sonia McCaskey back to her children. It couldn't restore the safety that had been shattered. The system had finally acted. but only after it was too late. It took longer to describe the crime than to convict him. The sentence was meant to be final. Death. For many, it felt like the only response that matched the crime, but years later, the rules changed. In 1972, the United States Supreme Court overturned all existing death penalty sentences. Overnight, certainty vanished. Thomas Lee Bean's punishment was reduced. Not freedom, but life imprisonment. No execution, no end date, just decades behind concrete walls. As the years passed, his name didn't fade. Instead, it became a statistic, a record. He remained incarcerated while the world outside changed. Laws rewritten, cities expanded, generations replaced. Bean aged in a cell, gray hair, slower steps, still breathing. Sonia did not get that luxury. Her children grew up without her. Her name survived only in files, headlines, and memories. The life she was building, cut short in one night, never had the chance to continue. Today, Thomas Lee Bean is the longest-serving inmate in Nevada's prison system. A living reminder of a crime that cannot be undone. Some see this as mercy, others see it as imbalance. Because no matter how long he lives behind bars, the math never evens out. He wakes up every day. She never did. He lived. She didn't. The murder didn't end at the courtroom doors. It followed Sonia McCaskey into the newspapers. Headlines competed for shock value, not truth, impact. Graphic language dominated front pages. Some publications went even further, printing explicit crime scene details and descriptions that went far beyond what the public needed to know. The focus shifted from justice to sensation. People were horrified, but not only by the crime. Readers wrote in anger. Families complained. Even seasoned investigators were disturbed, not by what they had seen at the scene, but by how freely it was being sold to the public. The coverage didn't honor the victim. It reduced her to an object of morbid curiosity. Sonia became a spectacle. Her name was no longer attached to her achievements, her children, or her life, but to the most extreme fragments of her death. Photos and descriptions circulated without restraint, stripping away dignity in the name of headlines and profit. This wasn't awareness. It wasn't accountability. It was exploitation. In chasing attention, parts of the media crossed a line, turning trauma into entertainment and pain into product. The killer sought notoriety, and the coverage handed it to him. For many, this became a second violation, one carried out not in the dark, but in plain sight. The murder shocked the world. The coverage disgusted it. When the noise faded, when the headlines moved on and the courtroom emptied, what remained was absence. Sonia McCaskey left behind 2 children who would grow up without their mother. One too young to remember her voice, the other old enough to feel the loss, but too young to understand it. Their lives continued, shaped by something they never chose and could never undo. The world remembers Sonia for how she died, but that was the smallest part of who she was. She was an immigrant who rebuilt her life, an Olympic skier who refused to quit after failure, a single mother balancing work, dreams, and responsibility. She planned for the future. She believed in routine. She trusted her world. All of that was erased in a single night. The brutality of the crime froze Sonia in history at her worst moment, overshadowing her achievements, her discipline, and her humanity. Even justice, swift and certain, could not restore what was taken. Cases like this often end with a conviction and the illusion of closure. But closure is a luxury the living sometimes claim. For the dead, only memory remains, and memory is fragile. Sonia deserved to be remembered for her strength, not her suffering. For the life she built, not the violence that ended it. Yet history rarely grants that mercy. Sonia McCaskey was more than her murder, but history remembers the crime.